Yeah, absolutely. All right, folks. Well, thanks for joining us today. Very excited about the talk today. Before we get into today's talk, I just want to bring everybody's attention to our talk next week as part of the lecture series on the future of work through the Applied Ethics Center at UMass Boston and the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies. So next week's talk will be with Stephen Umbrello at the University of Turin on the topic of the use of robots in military conflict. And that's next Wednesday, November 2nd at 12 p.m. Eastern time. And for today, because we have a bit of a different setup, just so you know, audience members, you're welcome to use the chat function for questions that come up during the course of the talk. But also, I think because we have a very intimate group of folks here, we can have conversations afterwards where we can actually unmute ourselves and ask our questions too. So very excited about the topic today, though, on social media and kids. The topic being, is it a moral panic or is it itself an actual public health threat? So we have with us today Vikram Bhargava, who's an assistant professor of strategic management and public policy at George Washington University School of Business, whose research centers around the distinctive ethics and policy issues that technology gives rise to in organizational contexts. So Vic, thanks for joining us today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Alec. It is a real pleasure to be here. And, I think that I'm so happy to have all of you giving up some time in your afternoon to think and talk about what I take to be at least a part of one of the more important problems of our time. So I, again, appreciate the invitation, and I'm delighted to be here. So in the last 10 years or so, social media has come under scrutiny for its role, under critical scrutiny for its role in a whole range of different untoward problems. For example, issues related to bullying on social media, the role of social media in radicalizing terrorists, the role of social media in revenge pornography, its role in bringing about group polarization effects or intellectual echo chambers, and of course its role in affecting global geopolitical events, including the most recent two US presidential elections. Now, these are all different ways in which social media can be used in furtherance of certain untoward ends. Now, what I'm interested in is a concern that arises even when social media is not used towards some obviously bad outcome. And this is with respect to using big data to elicit addiction. Now, this is Sean Parker, and he was the first president of Facebook, also the founder of Napster. Of course, he's not the founder, but he was the first president. And he asked that at the outset, their chief aim at Facebook was this: how do we consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible? Now, the primary claims that I'm going to make today are these. The first is that there's a distinctive kind of ethical wrongdoing involved when social media businesses make their platforms addictive. And second, this wrong is not wholly captured by the worries associated with other addictive products like alcohol and cigarettes. Now, as a brief roadmap of what's to come, I will first touch very briefly on the concept of internet addiction. Then what I'm going to spend most of the time doing today is trying to characterize certain features that make social media ethically distinct. And then after that, I'll touch on some implications for policy and practice. Then we can conclude and get into some questions, discussions, and so on. All right, so briefly on the concept of internet addiction. So as early as in the 90s, people started thinking about are noticing similarities between, for example, addiction to online chat platforms like AIM and other chat rooms and other sort of addictive behaviors. Now, of course, this research has matured considerably, and now there is a growing consensus that internet addiction, though it's of course not unanimous, it's not completely settled research here, I should say, that internet addiction and social media addiction in particular constitutes a real addiction just as well as any other sort of addiction, in large part due to it possessing these four properties. Now, the harms associated with internet addiction are well documented in leading journals. For example, poor performance at school and work, decline in ability to concentrate, loneliness and social anxiety, and increased rates of depression and suicide. And a point that I'll just flag for now is a number of these problems arise in virtue of the time spent on these platforms, and that'll become relevant to what I'm going to ultimately argue. So how is it that they make these platforms addictive? So there are lots of different tools that they use. For short, they hire teams of very sophisticated behavioral psychologists in Silicon Valley. But one of the most potent techniques that they use is what's called intermittent variable rewards. Now, one might think that what makes something addictive is the mere fact that there is a dopamine hit each time you use it. But rather, what makes something particularly addictive is not that there is a predictable reward, but rather there's an intermittent, unpredictable reward that you don't know in any given instance whether or not it will be rewarding, whether you'll get a like or a retweet or something of that sort. Now, there are a number of other tools that they use. For example, on the right of the screen, you see a faint wheel at the bottom there, a loading screen. Now, you might think this is because of having a slow internet connection, but that's not quite right. This is a purposeful decision that you'll see however fast or slow your broadband connection is. And this is to take advantage of the intermittent variable rewards. You don't know what's going to come next. You don't know how long it'll take to load. And there is purposeful variance, and they have the data for exactly how long it takes. This also takes advantage of this sort of infinite scroll that dramatically changes things, where you can keep scrolling, and you don't have natural stopping cues. So even a very, very, compelling Netflix show or novel, for example, there is a natural stopping cue. There is an end, but that's not quite the case with social media platforms. So this is sometimes colloquially called bottomless bowls. And you see there, a notification popped up. You might notice sometimes, if you're a Twitter user, that the notification alert is slightly delayed. And this too, a number of researchers have pointed out, is a purposeful decision. It varies between half a second to sometimes up to 3 seconds, again, to take advantage of intermittent variable rewards. Now, it's also not a phenomenon that's unique to the United States context. It's a global phenomenon. The South Korean and Chinese governments have declared internet addiction a significant public health issue, and the World Health Organization has characterized it as a growing problem. So now I'm going to get to the sort of core of the talk, which is what attributes make addicting users to social media ethically distinct. So I should clarify what I don't mean by that. So here are the 4 attributes that I'm going to touch on. Now, my claim is not that there are no other addictive products or activities that have some of these attributes. What I suggest is the case is that social media addiction is the unique member of the set of the intersection of these 4 attributes, basically. So let's start with the first one, value inconsistent addiction. Now, we often speak of being addicted to a range of different activities. For example, some people speak of being addicted to running or yoga, etc. Now, these sorts of addictions don't seem like they're quite as concerning as the more familiar kinds of addictions, for example, to cigarettes or alcohol. Now, it could be, of course, that people are just speaking loosely and they're using the word addiction in a way that perhaps that they shouldn't be. But there is, for example, at least medically documented evidence that one can be addicted to a fairly wide range of activities. So how do we make sense of why these addictions don't seem quite as concerning as, for example, addictions to, let's say, cigarettes, alcohol, and what I'm going to argue, social media? And you might think, well, those other kinds of things are harmful, but that's not quite right. There are documented harms with running addiction. There's arthritis, there are joint pains, and so on. So it's not that these activities are harmless. They may very well be harmful in important ways, but nevertheless, they don't strike us as quite as concerning, I think. Now, I think a way in which we might helpfully taxonomize the kind of concerning sorts of addictions from the less concerning sorts of addictions is based on Harry Frankfurt's famous distinction between first and second order desires. So I'll briefly sketch what this distinction is to those of you who may not be familiar with it. So all sorts of animals have desires. So for example, if a lion sees a zebra in the savannah, it might have a strong desire to go chase after that zebra and eat it. Now, the Princeton philosopher Harry Frankfurt pointed out, well, there's something special that is unique to persons. And this is that we have desires just like any other animal. For example, this morning when I went to Starbucks, I saw a chocolate croissant. I had a strong desire for it. But Frankfurt says there's something special about us, namely that we have those desires, but we also have desires about those very desires, second order desires. So I did truly desire that chocolate croissant, but I might not have desired that I desire it. So how does this distinction become relevant in the context of addiction? So take, for example, cigarettes. So there might be somebody who started smoking cigarettes as a teenager and now is, let's say, a middle-aged adult, and during his lunch break, like clockwork, he has a strong desire to go smoke a cigarette. But he also, let's say he's approaching his 60s, he also has a strong desire that he didn't have that desire. Why? Well, he wants to see his kids graduate college, potentially get married, potentially have kids of his own, kids of their own. So he has a strong first order desire to smoke a cigarette, but he also has desires about that very desire. Namely, he wishes he didn't have that desire. Now, some philosophers have argued that what it means to value something is to desire it. Now, this is, I think, David Lewis has characterized this conception of value. There are, of course, other conceptions of value, but this is a conception of value, that what it means to value something is to desire it. Now, it wouldn't make sense to say that this middle-aged cigarette smoker valued smoking cigarettes merely because he desired it, because he did not desire to desire it. In fact, he had the desire, but he wishes he didn't have that desire. He desired not to have that first order desire. Now, what I'm suggesting is that there's a growing body of evidence that suggests social media addiction takes the form of what we might call value inconsistent addictions, where the first and second order desires are not consistent with each other. Because although, for example, especially among teenagers, there's reports, I used to teach grade school myself, and I vividly remember students saying that I can't get my day started without checking my Facebook. And these are students who had Facebook since they were in second grade. And there's also a growing number of reports of teenagers saying that they wish they didn't have to do this, that they desire that they didn't have that desire. So I'm suggesting here there's at least some evidence to suggest that social media addiction takes the form of a value inconsistent addiction rather than, for example, addiction to running, where people not only have that strong desire to go for a run the first thing in the morning, but they also desire that desire in a lot of ways. They identify with running culture. They post their times online on one of the running apps with pride. They're sort of a part of the running community as something that they don't regret. So this is one way in which I'm suggesting that we can classify the concerning sorts of addictions with the less concerning kinds. So the first key attribute is social media addiction is plausibly a value inconsistent addiction. The second attribute that I want to touch on is what I call the harm-compulsion connection. Now, there have long been businesses that have sold addictive products, for example, cigarettes, tobacco, alcohol, perhaps even junk food. Now, is there something unique here with social media addiction? Now, I want to suggest that there is something unique here. It's not to say that it's necessarily worse or better, but that social media addiction raises certain ethical considerations that we don't see with other sorts of addictive products. And this has to do with the link between the compulsive dimension of the addiction and the harms associated with the addiction. So let me explain what I mean with an example. So with cigarettes, there's the compulsion to use it, and then there are the harms associated with it, the carcinogenic effects, the heart diseases, and the various different reasons why one might unfortunately end up in the hospital or with various different cancers and diseases. Now, with cigarettes, it's strictly a chemical engineering problem to design a cigarette that users use just as compulsively they have just as strong of an urge to go use at each lunch break, but does not bring about the various different cancers and heart diseases and so on. So to design a cigarette that people get that pleasant compulsive sensation that brings them to use it repeatedly, but does not bring about the attendant negative physiological effects. It is strictly a chemical engineering problem. Now, this is not to say it's an easy chemical engineering problem, nor that it's a chemical engineering problem that they're currently pursuing, but that the harm and the compulsive dimension are, at least in principle, separable. Now, why might that conceptual distinction be morally relevant? So I sort of see it as something like this. So suppose a public health activist were to confront a cigarette executive and tell the cigarette executive, how could you possibly live with yourself? You're intentionally harming millions and millions of people each year. The cigarette executive might respond as follows. Look, we are not intending to bring about these cancers and heart diseases in people. We are intending to design a product that people use compulsively because of how good it feels and to keep them hooked to it. But our aim is not to create cancers in people. That's not our intention. Now, you might think, well, that can't be a good faith response. That's an awfully sort of glib PR story that they're articulating. But I think this distinction, which, takes roughly the flavor of something, it's not quite exactly the same, but something roughly like a doctrine of double effect kind of point where, there are these foreseen negative side effects, but that's not what they're intending to bring about. I think there's actually some plausibility to it, because to the cigarette companies, the longer you stay alive and continue to buy their cigarettes, the greater your customer lifetime value is to them. So your ability to stay alive is positively related to your customer lifetime value to them. They have a strong incentive to keep you smoking, but to keep you alive. In fact, they have a counter incentive to have you die due to the negative physiological effects associated with cigarettes. Now, things are not quite the same, I suggest, in social media. Now, suppose, an activist for teenagers approaches a social media executive in Silicon Valley and says, here you are sitting at a coffee shop working on your social media company, but you're intentionally harming thousands and thousands of teenagers, kids, adults, and people who might not be aware of these harms all over the world. How could you live with yourself? Now, I think that this response that the cigarette executive has is not available to the social media executive. Because with social media, the compulsive use is constitutive of the harm in an important way, or at least inextricably tied up with the harms. So there isn't a comparable chemical engineering problem where they can sort of aim for one, but not the other. And, I sort of said that it might not be a sort of chemical engineering problem that cigarette companies are currently pursuing, but arguably, the Juul vape cigarettes aimed at doing just that, albeit unsuccessfully, but they did aim to create something that people use compulsively without the attendant harms. But with social media executives, they don't have that kind of response saying, well, we are aiming to, we're not intending to create these harms, we're just aiming to get them to use it compulsively, because the compulsive use is the very source of the harm. That is the sort of key harm. And in a lot of ways, it's tied up with the harm. So the cigarette executive can't aim for one without aiming for the other. So at least that response is not available, I'm suggesting, to the social media executive. The harm is not even in principle separable from the compulsive dimension. The harm is inextricably tied up with the compulsive dimension. Since the compulsive dimension is so closely linked to the harm, it is much less plausible that a business can aim for one without the other. Now, the third dimension that I suggest characterizes the sort of distinctive wrongness of addicting users to social media is that it constitutes an objectionable form of exploitation. Here's what I mean by that. So first, we need an account of exploitation. And one influential account of exploitation is Alan Wood's account. Now, I should be clear that there are a range of other accounts of exploitation. I think there are a number of advantages to this account of exploitation. But for our current purposes, I'm taking on board this account of exploitation, which holds that to exploit someone or something is to make use of him, her, or it for your own ends by playing on some weakness or vulnerability in the object of your exploitation. And on Alan Wood's account of exploitation, exploitation isn't itself necessarily wrongful. So for example, if I'm a basketball player and I exploit a lapse in attention of an opponent to steal the ball, there's nothing wrong that I've done, even though on Wood's account, that does satisfy the conceptual conditions associated with exploitation. Same goes with if I'm a criminal defense attorney and I notice a weakness in the prosecutor's argument, and I exploit that to advance my client's interests. It is exploiting that, but it's not necessarily wrongful on Wood's account. On Wood's account, what makes exploitation wrongful is when it's done in a way that's also disrespectful or insulting. So here is, to kind of spell out the components of Wood's account. So X engages in an objectionable form of exploitation of Y, if and only if X takes advantage of Y's vulnerability to advance X's ends in a way that disrespects Y. Tech firms addicting users to social media platforms increases their profitability. Increasing profitability advances the tech firm's ends. Therefore, tech firms addicting users to their social media platforms advances the tech firm's ends. Now, 2 and 3, I'm not going to argue for. I'm going to sort of take those premises on board. I think they're fairly plausible. The way tech firms addict users to their social media platforms disrespects those users. This is the disrespect premise, something that I have not yet argued for. When tech firms addict users to their platforms, they are taking advantage of their users' vulnerability. So this is the A condition and the C condition in the account of exploitation. Therefore, if I successfully motivate 5 and 6, it should follow that when tech firms addict users to their social media platforms, they engage in an objectionable form of exploitation. So let's get to the disrespect premise. So not only are social media companies addicting users to their platforms, I want to suggest that they do so in a particularly perverse way that adds insult to injury. And this is in virtue of a technical feature of the platforms, namely that they use adaptive algorithms. So adaptive algorithms, colloquially, basically involves where the more you use a platform, it learns from your usage, and then it tweaks its platform in response to your usage. You use it more, it gets more data about how you use it, it further tweaks its platform, and this process iterates such that it's able to use the data from your use of the platform, adjust the platform itself, and further tailor. Now, why is this troubling? So I want to suggest that this way of addicting users to social media raises a unique sort of moral wrong. And I want to illustrate this with an example. So this morning, I went to my neighborhood boutique coffee shop and I ordered a cup of coffee. And, let's suppose I finished the cup of coffee and then I tossed it in the garbage bin at the store. I walk out, and unbeknownst to me, the barista walks into the garbage bin, pulls out the cup of coffee, seals it up in a Ziploc bag, and sends it to the regional lab for processing, where they swab the lip of the cup, and they find out more about the biological properties that incline me toward addiction. And they're able to tweak the coffee recipe slightly, such that the next day I come in, I'm delivered a slightly more addictive cup of coffee. Again, I drink my coffee there while reading the paper. I toss my coffee out. And again, a barista comes into the trash can, gets the cup of coffee, swabs the lip of the cup, sends it in a Ziploc bag to the regional lab for processing. And again, they're able to tweak the recipe of the coffee slightly to make it slightly more addictive. Now, this process happens time and time again. It iterates until a few weeks later, I come to the coffee shop and I'm delivered a highly addictive cup of coffee. Not only that, they used me against myself in this very process. And that's what I'm suggesting. It makes it particularly insulting, where it's not only that we're going to do this bad thing to you, but we're going to get you to help us do this bad thing to yourself. It uses you against yourself. It makes you complicit in your own addiction, so to speak. And even in the coffee example, I may very well have been aware that coffee has some addictive potential. I knew that caffeine can be addictive, but I certainly did not sign up for a highly addictive cup of coffee, nor did I sign up for being used against myself in this very way. The Facebook and the Instagram that we have now is very different from the Facebook that I signed up for when I was in college. It's a very different platform. And what I'm suggesting is that the way in which they use us against ourselves, it's sort of, in some ways, paternalism is insulting because it sort of expresses the thought that we know about your interests better than you know your interests. But this is in some ways something worse than that, which is that, well, your interests don't even matter. We're just going to find a way to use you toward our interests. And you might be thinking, well, isn't it the case that the more you use a addictive substance, any addictive substance, the more addicted you become? The more you smoke a cigarette, the more addicted you become. And that is quite right. That's exactly right, but not exactly the point that I'm making. I'm not saying that the more you use social media, the more addicted you become, though that might be true. What I'm suggesting is that the more you use social media, the more you help it become addictive. It's akin to each time you smoke a cigarette, it learning from you and then adding nicotine to the cigarette itself. And that's what I'm suggesting is distinct here. Now, there's another important way in which social media addiction is distinct. With alcohol, cigarettes, for example, we might see our kids or teenagers. Maybe there's a deviant teenager who sneaks into his or her parents' alcohol cabinet, has a drink or two, throws a party, something like that. Now, with alcohol and cigarettes, very few of us would think that there's something lost if our kids were to start college without ever having had alcohol or cigarettes. In fact, we might think there's some advantages to, ensuring that they never have gotten exposed to cigarettes and alcohol, at least until they're sort of more, developed both physically and psychologically. Now, with social media addiction, things are a little different. Now, this is my group of students who I taught on the Big Island of Hawaii, and a number of them have had social media accounts since they were in second grade, kindergarten, or before. Now, for one, I think a straightforward point is it's not clear that at that age you know what you're signing up for. But two, one of the ways in which things are distinct is that the internet more generally has a whole range of very legitimate uses on our lives. Arguably, we can't flourish in contemporary society if we're not at least somewhat involved in the internet world. Now, you might think, well, the social media is different from the internet. That's true. But one of the concerns is that environmental cues make it such that you're just one step away from that thing that you're avoiding. And, if you get an email that says, well, you should look at this, new social media platform that you might sign up. So even if you quit, you're just one environmental cue away each time you log in on the internet. Now, here's a way in which things, I think, are different. So if we were to, for example, quit cigarettes or quit alcohol cold turkey, it's not clear that we've lost much. Or if we were to sort of tell our kids that you shouldn't, you should have no exposure to cigarettes or alcohol until you're an adult, or if at all, it's not clear that we've lost much. No, I don't mean to suggest that this is easy to quit. Of course, any of us who have family members who have dealt with addiction know just how difficult it can be to quit alcohol or cigarettes. So I'm not suggesting that it's easy, but rather I'm suggesting that once a person quits, it's not clear that there's much loss there, especially with cigarettes. Of course, alcohol, it's more common in contemporary professional and social situations. Same with something like casinos, something that's not a substance. Somebody who might be, let's say, addicted to gambling, not much is lost were they to quit gambling and never walk into a casino again. Now, certainly with the internet more generally, quite a bit is lost in contemporary society. So there are a whole range of legitimate uses that bring one to use the internet more generally, but also social media in particular. At this point, for example, to participate in a range of social goods, the most straightforward way to do so is by way of logging in through a social media app. If you want to engage in, participate in various romantic goods, online dating apps, the most straightforward way is through a social media platform. A lot of logins for professional websites like LinkedIn might be through a social media platform. There are a whole range of legitimate uses. So for example, even if we want our citizens to be informed, a fairly wide range of global geopolitical events are announced by executives on social media platforms. There are a lot of legitimate reasons why we might have to participate in the internet generally, but also social media in particular. Now, in the school context, this changed very rapidly where, I think that it used to be a liability to have a social media account, but now there's, surveys of employers who are suspicious if a millennial or Gen Z does not have a social media account. It raises a red flag if they don't have an online presence. And even as early as in grade school, well-meaning teachers, trying to come up with clever, engaging assignments. In every class that I've taught in the last 5 years, I've had a student say that they've had a history teacher ask them to make, for example, a Twitter profile for Thomas Jefferson. So even being a successful, flourishing student requires in a lot of ways to participate in these platforms. So this is all to say that even if our kids, our teenagers, or even our adults are not yet addicted, there are just innumerable opportunities because of the various different legitimate reasons that we have to be on these platforms. So there's a sort of particularly insidious way in which, well, you might not be addicted yet, but every instance you use it, it learns more about you and people who are statistically similar to you. So it's not only your uses helping them sort of tweak it to you, it's of course helping them, maybe you don't care, but it is helping them tweak it to people who are statistically akin to you as well. So this is the point that we're sort of vulnerable to this in virtue of the very many legitimate reasons that we have to be on the internet more generally, but also increasingly social media in particular. So I gave some reasons to think why the way in which they addict users to social media, that is through using you against yourself, disrespects the users, and that they're taking advantage of a person's vulnerability also in virtue of the pervasive need, or at least strong reasons to be on the internet, and in growing number of instances on social media in particular. So if that is plausible, then what follows deductively is that when tech firms addict users to their social media platforms, they engage in an objectionable form of exploitation. So the last attribute that I'm going to touch on is what I call the attention economy incentive. And so the first three attributes characterize the nature of the wrong. This characterizes the incentive to perpetrate that wrong. And this has to do with the nature of the business model. Now, you might think that the point that I'm making is about, is relevant to sort of any tech business that uses these psychologically manipulative tools. But that's not quite right. So for example, Netflix does use, automatically rolling over to the next episode. Arguably the contemporary term binge watching is due to Netflix. There are a whole host of behavioral psychology tools involved to keep us watching these platforms. But there is a way in which I think Netflix, Xbox Live, these other sorts of platforms where the revenue is coming from the users is significantly different from social media businesses, where the revenue is not coming from the users, but rather, as the familiar slogan goes, you're the product, or your attention, more accurately, is the product. And the revenue is coming from the advertisers. Now, here is why I think that this is importantly different. So with something like Netflix, of course, creating, bingeable content is something that helps them get new signups, new memberships. But with Netflix, once you've signed up, as long as you continue to have your membership at the same or increased rate, it's immaterial to them how much you actually watch. So let's say, same goes for example, HBO Max. Once I've signed up for HBO Max, it's immaterial to HBO whether or not I in fact watch House of Dragons all night, as long as I have the membership at the same or increased rate. Arguably, they might even have reasons, for me not to binge watch it, to the extent that royalty costs and bandwidth costs are higher. So if I were to, this is true even with other sorts of addictive physical products, like a cigarette. With the cigarette company, they, of course, want it to be addictive right now so that I continue to buy cigarettes. But as long as I buy a pack of cigarettes at the same or increased rate, it's immaterial to them whether or not I in fact smoke it or use the cigarettes to make a model bridge or something else, as long as I buy the cigarettes at the same or increased rate. Now, of course, addictive cigarettes and bingeable content are currently their means to getting you to continue to buy these products, but it's not a sort of necessary part of their business model. With Netflix, if you continue to sign up and never watched anything for 6 months, doesn't matter to them. That's not the case with attention economy businesses. If I were to sign up for Facebook or Instagram or TikTok and were to never use it, this does not work for a Meta Group. This is because what they need is my persistent, consistent use. So in a lot of ways, extended use and addiction is a sort of critical part of the business model in a way that that's not the case, even with other businesses that have sold addictive products. Now, I should make clear, I don't mean to this is not me, the cigarette companies haven't hired me to run apologetics for them. They've, of course, clearly done, lots of different heinous things, both in universities and in third world countries. That's not what I'm suggesting here, but rather I'm suggesting that there is a way in which the incentive to addict is fundamental to the attention economy business model in a way that it's not quite that with other sorts of addictive businesses. Given this aim of keeping users on for as long as possible, on, active, and engaged, something that's inherent to the business model, the fact of the compulsion being inextricably linked to the harm, they have, not only are they sort of aiming at this thing that inextricably harms you because of its link to the compulsion, they have a strong incentive to do that. Social media businesses have a strong incentive to keep users engaged with their platforms for as long as possible. So here are the 4 attributes that I discussed. The first and second order desires not being consistent with one another, the harm and the compulsion not even in principle being separable, it constituting an objectionable form of exploitation, and having a strong fundamental reason to do the wrongs characterized in attributes 1 through 3. So to sum it up, addicting users to social media unjustifiably harms them in a way that is demeaning and objectionably exploitative. And in the last couple minutes, I will really briefly run through some implications for policy and practice, and then we'll open it up for conversation and questions. So, the heads of the social media companies have testified before Congress many times now in the last 5 years or so. So it's clearly a hot issue by way of public policy. Now, what might we do? Well, in China, they've taken a sort of heavy-handed approach. And, this is from a documentary, I'm forgetting the name of it, where there are sort of internet addiction boot camps aimed at teenagers, where in some instances, these teens are told that they're being taken on a family vacation, but dropped off at these boot camps where they're, given various different kinds of vitamins through tubes, in some cases, placed in solitary rooms. My guess is, even if this wasn't concerning, we don't have the appetite for this in the United States. So what might we do here? So, I'll sketch a few less heavy-handed approaches. So the first has to do with simply just having a more empowering platform design. So, these graphics are courtesy of Tristan Harris. And, we could just create platforms that are slightly more empowering, where it says, for example, didn't you check 10 seconds ago? They have all of the data to be able to tell you how long you're likely to spend where you to click on a certain notification. Just empower the user in that way with that information. Now, as we know, information is often not sufficient, but it might at least help in terms of mute the insult of, well, we're going to do this thing to you and there's no way around it. We're informing the users. Another thing that we should look at, I think, is, at least in the United States, our public health campaign against cigarettes was, an incredible public health success. Just in my lifetime, there's, I remember people smoking cigarettes on airplanes, and there always being packs of people smoking out in front of office buildings. That's really not the case anymore in the United States. And a lot of that did change with, lots of resources devoted to more conclusively getting research about the harms associated with the platform. And we definitely do still need that. The empirical research associated with this is still not nearly as mature as it is with the cigarettes. Now, in the way that we might have nutrition effects with food, social media companies have the data to, for example, alert you. Perhaps a portion of the page could tell you, here's how likely it is, for example, to affect your sleep at night tonight. Here's how much time you've spent on average on the platform. Here's how likely it is to, increase or lower your mood on a given day. And they do have the data about this to, for example, present you with this sort of information. Now, with respect to kids, this is the way in which I think my chief concern with this topic is with respect to kids and teenagers. Now, in the last 10 years, there's been a dramatic spike in teenage girl suicides and depression associated with, that maps on very neatly to when social media first came on the iPhone. So when they had social media on them at all times. Now, this school here is the Waldorf School of the Peninsula, a less than a 10-minute drive from the headquarters of Apple, Facebook, and a range of other Silicon Valley tech companies. Now, a number of Silicon Valley executives send their kids to this school. Now, at this school, no technology whatsoever is allowed until 9th grade. And after 9th grade, only limited technology is permitted in very specific, constrained ways. Now, I think it's worth figuring out why it is that social media executives want their kids to attend schools like this one. But on a less glib note, I think that there's a way in which, and I do understand it, just 10 minutes away from this school is a school in a low-income community where every single child has an iPad at that school that was donated by one of the tech companies. Now, I taught in a low-income school district, and I absolutely understand wanting children in such communities to have the very best technologies. But I do think that it's worth reflecting on whether a more technologically sophisticated classroom is a more pedagogically sophisticated classroom. And I don't think that it's obvious that it is. Now, there has been a whole lot of buzz about the sort of gap in access to technology between low-income communities and high-income communities. And, in a lot of ways, high-income communities have access to more technology. But I think there's a different, the sort of digital gap, as they call it. But I think there's another important gap called the digital use gap, we might call it, which is that children in low-income communities have on average 2 hours more a day of screen time than children in higher income communities. And already children in higher income communities on average are getting approximately 6 hours a day of screen time. So, you know, although we should, of course, ensure that children in, you know, communities, regardless of their socioeconomic circumstances, should get the best possible education, it's not clear that the way to do that involves technology, or at least I think it's something that we ought to reflect on with more care. You know, here's just something that I added. There is this documentary that a number of you have seen called The Social Dilemma, and Facebook's response. So they said, well, they argue that one, addiction, that's not what their aim is. Facebook builds its products to create value, not to be addictive. But of course, they fail to see that it's entirely consistent that that's their aim, but it's nevertheless also addictive. There's no sort of inconsistency with this and it being addictive. And the last is a small point, which is what I call lower the barriers to exit. Suppose there is somebody who wants to quit Facebook. Here's what it currently takes, right? So somebody, you know, it's about somebody who's already decided that they want to quit for whatever reason. Here's what it takes. So you need to know to click that bottom arrow. Once you click that bottom arrow, you're brought to this screen where you know to click settings. Fine, that's fairly obvious. And then you need to click, you're brought to this screen with about 13 or so options on the left, and you need to know to click your Facebook information. I might have thought it's security and login, but you should know to click your Facebook information. So once you click that, you're brought to this screen where it gives you another 5 options. And at the bottom, it says deactivation and deletion. Now you'd think that when you click that, you're done, but not quite yet. Then you're brought to this screen. Do you want to deactivate or permanently delete? So let's go with deactivate. And then we're brought to another screen where it says, are you sure you want to deactivate your account? And then below that, there are 5 algorithmically curated photographs of people that the algorithm thinks is most likely for you to sort of get you to thwart this process. And below each, it says send William a message, send Laura a message, send Emily a message, and were you to send that message, it would thwart the deactivation process. And above each, it says William will miss you, Laura will miss you. And it's not necessarily the people who you've interacted with most, but rather the ones where it might get you to think, well, maybe it's worth sticking around. I haven't spoken to this person in a while. It would be good to sort of see what they're up to. Anyway, let's say you keep going forward. Then you have to select a reason for leaving. And this is required, as you can see. So let's say I click one of them. This pops up. Let's say I select, I don't find Facebook useful. It says you may find Facebook more useful by connecting with more of your friends. Great. And if you were to do that, that ends the deactivation process. Let's say you click, I spend too much time using Facebook. Then it says, one way to control your interaction with Facebook is to limit the number of emails you receive from us. Let's say you continue on. And you press deactivate one more time. There's one more pop-up where it says, are you sure you want to deactivate your account? And now if you press deactivate, you are deactivated. What does it take to reactivate? Just log back in. That's it. Doesn't ask you, are you sure you want to reactivate? Are you sure you want to be on Facebook again? You do the very thing that you've habitually been doing the first thing you wake up. And if you instinctively log back in with your email and password because it's a habit, you're reactivated. Let's say you were to permanently delete instead. It takes 30 days before it completes the deletion. Now, it stuns me. I'm not, I don't have the technical understanding of this, but it stuns me that a company that's as technologically sophisticated as Facebook takes 30 days to delete one user's account. You might wonder why. Well, in those 30 days, if you have second thoughts or inadvertently log back in, you're back on again. So this last one is just lower the barriers to exit. And to conclude, there's a distinctive wrong in making social media platforms addictive. The attention economy generates a strong incentive to addict, and the problem to these platforms should not be understated. Thank you so much for listening, and it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, Vic. Really informative but terrifying stuff, as I'm sure all of us feel in some ways. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up to questions from folks in the audience. Anybody have first questions?
Sure, I'll go
Yeah,
first.
Oh yeah, Dan, go ahead.
Okay. That was really interesting, Vikram. A couple things. It almost feels like you're kind of parsing degrees of cynicism here.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering how far it really gets you in the long run. I mean, I think some of the ideas around black box labels and things like that might be a useful thing. By the way, as a technologist, of course, it doesn't take Facebook 30 days to discontinue your account. That's ridiculous. It's just all part of the engineering. And the other thing I kind of wanted to ask you to think about is back in the old days, there was this thing called commercial broadcast television,
Uh-huh.
and the viewer was the product,
Right.
right? So, I mean, that may be just a plea for some,
Absolutely.
recognition that yeah, okay, tobacco, the cigarette's the product, and alcohol, the scotch is the product, but the idea that the user is monetized
Right.
isn't novel.
Right. That's absolutely right. Yep.
Nor is it novel at this scale.
Right.
But it is novel, I think, at the concurrent scale, right? I mean, broadcast television is always reaching people all over the world all the time, but not the same broadcaster.
Uh-huh. So thank you for your questions. I'll sort of go backward. You're exactly right that the attention economy business model itself is not novel. TV has been on that, radio has been on that. This is a familiar business model as such. Now, in fact, I think even with TV, there has been some tailoring also, right? Nielsen ratings are used to make judgments about what sort of content to give to a given region. Now, I think the way in which it's unique is that this tailoring, rather than happening at a broad community level, the thing that I think is new is the ability to tailor in real time at the individual level, basically, right? This is something that I think is unprecedented in significant ways, such that it's not just, well, hey, this coast, this demographic gets this content. It's, you and the other person in your household may very well see entirely different interfaces. So, I certainly appreciate that point.
They would have done that if they could, right?
They may very well have. And, I suspect that, if you look at smart televisions, they're increasingly getting sophisticated. There are social media tools that are sort of implemented into the television hardware. So, for me, I'm less concerned about whether we call it social media or a television that has these features, but rather it's the concerns that arise in virtue of having this cluster of properties. So if a smart television were to, in this way be responsive to us, then I think it's sort of conceptually akin, at least, to the sort of distinction between, well, is it social media or not, is eroding. And in a lot of ways, that's true in both directions, right? Like, I think people used to watch Sunday morning cartoons with children. Now they're getting much of that content on YouTube. And, this has also allowed them to skirt, in a lot of ways, restrictions on what sorts of content that children can be exposed to. But I think you are right that, I'm concerned about these specific features and ways, but these features associated with social media currently can very well be applied to other kinds of, substrates, so to speak. So I appreciate the point. Thank you.
And the question about parsing degrees of cynicism.
Say more about that point.
Well, I mean, I mean, just that it seems to me that you can kind of make an excuse for the alcohol purveyor or the tobacco pusher that, or any other drug pusher.
Right.
That, well, they're just trying to give you a product that you want. And the fact that it's harmful to you is a side effect. But it strikes me that to attribute kind of a deeper cynicism to the social media, not that I'm a fan of these guys, mind you, but to attribute a deeper cynicism to these guys is doesn't hold a lot of water for me.
So the concern, I suppose, is that in a lot of ways, people are in general suspicious about things being addictive that aren't physical substances. People think that there is something special about the fact that we've injected something or consumed it physically, even though the reasons for why, that's just the mode in which the addiction is created, but the underlying phenomena is the same, whether it's, so gambling is a sort of important exception to this, where people do recognize gambling to be addictive. But in general, I think there has been a greater degree of, well, something about this feels innocuous. Well, we're just clicking on puppy pictures. We're just sort of, wishing somebody happy birthday. And what I want to suggest is that, at least in certain ways, that there are, serious ethical concerns that are new in this context that merit its own attention, which, attendantly might mean that we shouldn't just take the same exact approach that we've had with respect to, for example, other kinds of addictive products. And it may very well raise unique public health interventions or public policy interventions. But I think that certainly those are sort of fine distinctions. And part of the project is to try to characterize, well, in what ways in which is there something conceptually salient here? And but thank you, I appreciate the question.
Thank you. It was very interesting.
I think
Unfortunately, I have to run to another meeting. But
Thank you for the question.
thanks for taking my question first.
My
Bye.
pleasure.
Thanks, Dan. Henry, go ahead.
Quick, thank you so much for this. I really love it. Just to clarify what you just said. So if I look at Amazon and Amazon's kind of like implement some of these tools. So if Amazon was really doing the same thing to keeping me engaged on the site, you will say that it's not ethically right. It's an ethical wrong. Correct?
Did I let you finish? I don't want to interrupt you.
Yeah, no, go ahead, please.
So, not quite. So I don't think that, for example, the mere fact of using something for a long time is necessarily ethically concerning, nor even using behavioral tools that might get us to do something. So, for example, if I have an Apple Watch that might, for example, get me to exercise more frequently. Now, there are people who do think that it's wrong for us to gamify ourselves in this way also. But, that's not what I'm not suggesting that the mere fact of these psychological manipulations are itself the sort of source of the concern. So here's what I mean. I don't think, for example, if I'm a novelist that writes a very compelling novel where at the end of the chapter, I create a cliffhanger just so that they get to the next chapter, I don't think that the novelist has done anything wrong there. The way in which I think it becomes concerning with social media is when they're doing that, plus the bit about it being a desire that you don't endorse, right? So it's the conjunction of the fact of this manipulation to get you to do something that you yourself don't endorse. Now, it raises, I think, a really interesting question about, well, a lot of these companies have people working from them who are, just our students in a lot of ways, good, smart, well-meaning kids. And, how do we sort of, understand their moral responsibility, for example? There's this, I think, deep and interesting question about what's the distinction between intending to make a product more attractive versus intending to make a product more addictive? Now, I think that's a deep question. I don't have a sort of fully worked out answer, but my first stab at that would be something like this, that if somebody is intending to make a product more attractive, they're trying to further both your first and second order desires that are aligned. They're sort of promoting both of those in certain ways. But if they're only intending to addict, then what your second order desire is entirely immaterial. They're entirely concerned with, for example, manipulating your first order desire to get you to do this thing. And it's entirely irrelevant to them whether or not you endorse this desire. So in short, I think that these sort of tools of the behavioral psychology tools used in conjunction with promoting something that you yourself don't endorse is what I'm suggesting characterizes, the nature of the wrong there.
Okay. Do I have time for the follow-up, or are we running out?
No, go ahead.
Yes. So what's really interesting to me, because my work focuses more on the content and misinformation, and I appreciate that yours goes up goes above beyond that, because it really doesn't matter the content. It's what the company is doing from the get-go.
Oh,
I don't know, that still kind of worries me that maybe they may find a way to point at the good that they do, or like all the and entrepreneurship and all the other benefits, how social media is being used during the war in Ukraine, or how did social movements like in Iran or so forth take shape in Black Lives Matter, for example, in our own country. So they may say that, yeah, hey, we're doing something great, we're connecting people.
right.
But I don't know. I'm not quite sure there.
It's a great comment. And I don't deny that social media companies have been hugely helpful in the case of, for example, the Arab Spring, the Black Lives Matter movement, and so on. I think what I'm sort of tempted to say in such cases is, it's not that I think that there is a way in which social media can do this without also having to use these manipulative, addictive tools, or at least use these addictive tools toward ends that we ourselves don't endorse. Thank you.
Nir.
So Vic, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating and really thought-provoking. I have a few questions or comments. I'm not sure about all of them. The first is to your point early in the presentation that some of the unique feature of social media is that it's more difficult to separate the compulsive aspect of the technology and the harm that it does. I wonder if part of that, which I agree with, I think that's a very insightful point. I wonder if part of that is because the harm that the product does is not directly from the use of social media itself, as opposed to because it amplifies a psychological tendency that we already have. So the lungs of a smoker are clean before they start smoking. All of us have tendencies for comparison, for desires for recognition, et cetera, that these technologies, as it were, amplify to unhealthy degrees. Is that part of why the harm and the compulsion can't be separated?
That's interesting. My concern is that I suppose there are going to be antecedent psychological and physiological dimensions that predispose somebody to addiction, whatever the addictive product might be, right? So, the reason somebody might, junk food is tailored in such a enhanced way, such that it takes advantage of our predisposition to crave something that triggers our, craving for things that are very sweet or very, fattening, and overwhelms us in a lot of ways. So it's in a lot of ways takes these, I think, constellation of attributes that you correctly identified as these pre-existing, very human components, interest in social status, comparisons, etc., but then just saturates it in a way that I don't think that we know how to handle yet.
Right. I mean, the cigarettes, to be fair, operate on the same thing, but more indirectly, right? So, you have the whole 50s, 60s, 70s, even 80s kind of culture where, smoking becomes associated with status and coolness and so on and so forth. And you have the James Dean look and whatever you want to call it. But the causality seems more indirect than social media, which almost is designed to zoom in on this sort of Rousseauian obsession we have with comparison.
Yeah, please. I think that's perceptive, and I think it strikes me as very plausible.
The second question I had goes to the point that you made later on in the presentation, about the difference in revenue model and the business model between a Netflix and a Facebook, and that is that the revenue comes from the user or for the advertiser. So the business model, just sort of recapping the argument, so the business model that's at the heart of social media's toxicity is that advertisers provide the revenue, and therefore the product is incentivized to be addictive, so that the advertising gets the most out of it. So to me, that sounds like if we get to the root of the problem, then advertising is the inherently toxic or problematic activity, and potentially the sort of under-noticed moral problem of the age.
So it's an interesting thought. I once had, I'd quit Facebook, and I heard from a few friends who messaged me and say, hey, did you send this direct message to me? And I was alarmed because I no longer had a Facebook account. And, so then I asked a few more people and said, did you get messages from somebody who is presenting themselves as me? And a few other friends said, yes. So, I was really nervous about this, that somebody was going around messaging people who were in fact my friends, sort of pretending to be me. And, I reached out to try to find Facebook customer service, but there is no such thing because I'm not a customer. So, I just kind of, I then went on Twitter. I tried to, shame them on Twitter for this, and, no response whatsoever. So I think, one of the key things is that it's not just that they're advertisers, but rather it's that so here's how, my sort of hypothesis here is, some people have said that, well, we need to do away with the attention economy business model entirely. And I'm not sure, I think there might be a way for a more intermediate approach. And here's what I mean by that. So to put it as a slogan, I think that we get rid of, perhaps not all, but most of the bad consequences associated with social media. And I think you are quite right that the heart of, social media addiction is just a manifestation of one of the problems, but all of these issues, misinformation, radicalization, are in virtue of this business model, right? Because fake information transmits much faster, radicalization, things that make us angry, sad, or disgusted is more likely to get engagement. So all of this at the heart is this business model. So that seems exactly right. And, I've sort of focused on one of these symptoms, but there are a whole bunch of other symptoms, I think, of this business model. But I don't know that, one way in which I think that we might be able to stop short of getting rid of the attention economy business model in general is if we approach something like this, where if social media companies wanted to maintain an ad-based attention economy business model, then they shouldn't tailor the interfaces to specific individuals. On the other hand, if they want to tailor to specific individuals, then they should be on a membership model, basically. Now, I think this actually dramatically, either of these options gets rid of a lot of the issues, because the problem arises with the conjunction of incentives that are not aligned with the users, only aligned with advertisers, and the tailoring for that rather than for you. So if, for example, social media was on a membership model, then they could tailor to you, to what you actually want, the things that you endorse. Or if they were on an ad-based business model and they weren't tailoring at all, this also, I think, gets rid of quite a bit of the sort of unique problems. So I think that's something to do, so, something in that flavor of recognizing that, the problem arises because of the conjunction of the attention economy incentive and the tailoring together. And if we were to cleave those two apart, I think we might be able to get some of the sincere benefits, like its role in a number of important social movements, without quite as much of the sort of toxic dimensions associated with it.
So maybe this is a continuation of what Nir was talking about here. And I just want to hear even more from you about what you think about this. So, this worry about second order volitions,
Yeah.
that seems to be implicit in advertising, right? The fact that advertising exists is often because we we need to be sold that we should want this thing, even if we know that we don't necessarily want it, right? And that is the dominant form of the business model. And so there's, yeah, I'm sure you know all this literature, but there's some literature about Web 2.0 essentially creates a system of expectant organizing, right, where the users themselves are the ones that really develop these platforms. I mean, it's kind of an open slate, and then the users are expected to do the building of the platform. And so there are some people who want to say this is a form of digital labor, that's exploitation in a different way. But I guess then I want to hear you say a little bit more about maybe the problem of data privacy. And you kind of touched on it a little bit already, right? But there have been ideas like data trusts. Data trusts are maybe a way that we can make use of data, but keep it private to a certain extent. So I think I want to hear your thoughts on sort of all of that, which I know is a lot. But, in particular, this idea of if it is really users, and the main model of social media platforms is to have users expectantly organized so that they can collect data and sell data to advertisers. Do we need to adopt a GDPR style data privacy regulation mechanism, or so what do we do in that area of this problem?
Thank you. A few points. So first, I've been, I think, correctly criticized in the past for not having these public policy interventions that I've articulated be heavy-handed enough, that not calling for a stronger regulatory solution. And I accept that criticism. In a lot of ways, I didn't dive down that path because I think that generally it's good to have a sizable body of, there's a lot of empirics to sort out there about the sort of unintended consequences of regulation that doesn't fall within my expertise. So I didn't want to, speak to that. That's why I'm sort of kind of just sketching what I think might be a more promising approach to the business model. Now, I think that on reflection, I think that both yours and Nir's question about advertising, especially in line with the point that you sort of brought up about first and second order desires, I'm tempted and I'm moved by it. I mean, I think there is a way in which advertising is, often it just seems your second order desires might be entirely irrelevant to their enterprise. Now, one way we might move forward is by saying, well, to engage in ethical advertising requires attending to not just, for example, as they call it, the revealed preferences, but also their stated and reflected preferences that are often seen as a trivial matter. So people sort of see it as, well, the only real preferences are revealed preferences. But why? Why not have our, why not have our reflective stated preferences also be something that's taken into account, at least in some way? So that's what I would say about that. With respect to the data privacy and sort of, this is a great question, and a lot of people have sort of thought about it in interesting ways. I mean, I think one of the things that people have sort of written about that is compensating people for their data. One of the challenges with this, I think, is that any one of our data individually is really worthless, right? It's not worth that much. Arguably, we're getting much, much more for free from the platform than our individual data. Now, when you apply very sophisticated, machine learning spotlights on an astonishing amount of data, then you can get massively lucrative insights from it. So that's one worry with that. Another worry is a sort of, maybe a more philosopher's worry, which is that I'm not sure why data is any different from, if I were to go to my neighborhood park and I notice that people really get thirsty at this corner of the park, I've made that observation. Is that data that they own, or is that just a sort of observation that I made that people are thirsty and want a lemonade stand there? Now, I did notice that. They might not have let me look, they might not have said that, anything about that, but I just noticed it. Or, other things that I noticed, other sort of, sets of propositional facts that I come to be aware of about other people. In what ways, I guess another way to put it is, what's special about data? It seems like the issue is less about the data itself, but these kind of really sophisticated tools that could be used against ourselves. That kind of, it could be very well be the case that you take data plus apply these tools, it changes the nature of both of them, right? So it's this sort of, but I'm not sure beyond that, other than to sort of say that I would kind of want to hear a little bit more about what's kind of special about data.
Yeah. So just a real brief follow-up to that, just additional questions, not that you have to answer, but I think that are interesting to this conversation that somebody needs to uncover, whether it's a philosopher or somebody else, right? But so this idea of what is the difference between that data and going to, as you said, my local public park,
right?
That I then think raises really important questions about, are these platforms similar to the public sphere?
Yeah.
In which case, are they subject to a kind of regulation that private entities aren't, right? And so, because if you were spying in my apartment through my window, now all of a sudden we have a very different, different situation. So again, I just think even that example presents some really interesting pathways to go down to figure out. And lots of people have discussed this, but anyway, that's another topic of discussion. But.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right, and an astute observation. Yeah.
Yeah, Vic, one more follow-up on an earlier point that you made. I really like the analogy with gradually increasing tailored coffee cup that becomes more and more addictive responsively. I thought that was brilliant. That becomes more responsively addictive to your behavior. I guess to complete that analogy, one thing I would add, though, is does that policy by Starbucks become less exploitive if you are made aware of it, and then the next day come and buy the Starbucks anyway? And that seems to me to be part of what's happening with social media users.
Right. It's a great point. I do think that a way in which, it doesn't get rid of the sort of harms of the exploitation, but it does mute the insult if the users were told that, hey, we're going to be using this information in such and such ways. Now, it's not to sort of suggest that informed consent just, is somehow, it creates a clean slate by way of moral issues that gets rid of the moral concerns. We can sort of consent to all sorts of wrongful treatments that doesn't, if I consent to you calling me a racial slur, it still would be wrong for you to call me a racial, with a racial slur, even if I consented to it, of course. But I do think that you're exactly right, that if they were a little clearer about this, then I think that it at least gets rid of some of that flavor of, we're going to do this thing to you, you're not going to do anything about it, and we're going to use you against yourself, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, I guess what I mean more specifically is when I talk to my students, for example, either in an intro course or in a more specialized ethics of technology course, on some level or other, they are aware of the "you are the product" kind of argument. Some of them even in a pretty sophisticated level. And yet they just, not to put too fine a point on it, they don't give a shit. They don't care. What to put it in your terms earlier, in some ways, what they get is so much more valuable than the specific individualized loss of privacy, as far as they're concerned, that they would happily choose to keep doing it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's, I've sort of had similar experiences in a lot of ways in the classroom. I think that it's, there's sort of important work to be done in terms of understanding what the scope of that consent is, sort of ranges over.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to speak to I think it speaks to sort of degrading of the amount of value that we put on things like privacy, for example,
Right.
which may be one of the sort of undiscussed costs of, the social media
Right.
ecosystem, namely that it has actually wrought a pretty significant social change in what we value and what we don't.
Right. I mean, that's sort of to sort of put your point that I think you're making in a different way. It's not even that it's eroded our privacy, but it's eroded our very conception that that is valuable.
Right.
Which is
exactly.
really striking.
Yeah,
right?
that's a much more concise way of making the point. Yeah.
I-
I think, Alec, that we're more or less running out of time. Vic, this was absolutely wonderful, and
It was my pleasure. Thanks to all of you.
I hope we can stay in touch.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. And please feel free, anybody, to shoot me an email. You can find me online, and I'd love to continue the conversation.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Yeah, Vic, thank you so much. I appreciate
Thank you. Take care.
it. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.